Music of Astor Piazzolla, Tango Bordel, and it's an arrangement we're hearing made for the saxophone by the virtuoso artist who's playing it in this performance. He is Ashu, a fast-rising musical personality, making a very individual and charismatic mark as one of the relatively few classical saxophone soloists that there are. National radio and television networks have already discovered his striking talents and imagination. And now it's Classical Connect's turn to put the spotlight on his music, his instrument, and his history as an artist, in his own words, recorded specially for this podcast, and beginning at the beginning, with how it was that he first became engrossed in the music and repertoire of the classical saxophone.
The way it all started was I was about 10 years old, and I was just riding in the car with my parents one day, and I heard this sound on the radio, and I had never heard anything like it before in my life. I mean, just the sound of it just floored me, and it captivated me that for days that's all I could think about. Something about the sound of the saxophone has just a very organic, human, a very natural quality that's just really, really just took to me. So I begged my parents for a saxophone, and they agreed, and the next year I was old enough to join the school band. And, you know, it's a pretty traditional way of starting an instrument, but for me, the moment I started, I just loved everything about it, about playing the instrument, about making music, about practicing, just the look and feel of the instrument. I was really taken by it. And so that was pretty much how it started for me. And, I went the traditional route of playing in the school band a few years after, started taking some lessons, and it was really when I started listening to music, to the great classical soloists, to the Pavarotti, the Heifetz, and people like that, that everything became very clear, and I knew what I wanted to do. And, I started entering competitions, and that was sort of how I got my first taste of performing, which is, what I just really, really fell in love with. But I can say what really got me into music was just listening to recordings and getting a taste of, the great soloists and what is possible in classical music.
It's very interesting that you say that, because the people that you've been listening to, the people who've influenced you, have been some of the most wonderful performers of the last 100 years. And so I'm very interested indeed, because this is why I feel you're bringing a very important recognition to your instrument in terms of what it can do in linking up with the great tradition of music making. I feel that this is something that's in you, is a great understanding of classical style and also of romantic style and also of modern style. This is why I think it's so fascinating that the inspiration for you were not necessarily people who played the saxophone, but people who were great musicians. And I think that this can be heard in your phrasing, in your colours, and in your whole approach. And before we actually look at some of what you've done, just a few words, in fact, about the repertoire that there is in the symphony orchestra for the saxophone. I mean, one thinks of wonderful pieces like L'Arlésienne of Bizet, Romeo and Juliet of Prokofiev, the symphonic dances of Rachmaninoff, and, of course, the pictures in an exhibition in Ravel's orchestration of Mussorgsky's score. There's so much, isn't there?
There is a tremendous amount of repertoire, and people don't always realize that. Of course, all those pieces you mentioned, where the saxophone is included in the orchestra, everyone has written for it, from Shostakovich to Ravel to Prokofiev to Rachmaninoff, as you mentioned. And there's also a tremendous wealth of solo concerto repertoire by composers like Glazunov, Debussy, Villalobos, Ibert, Vincent d'Indy, Frank Martin, so many great composers, and then there's recital music by, works by Paul Hindemith, and there's just a tremendous amount of great music by great composers, and people don't always realize that. But also, one point you mentioned earlier about arrangements is that I think the saxophone has such potential. It's an instrument that can sing like a voice, that can play with such effortless virtuosity like a pianist. It can play with the most subtle color variation, has an extreme dynamic range, and that's why so much music can be adapted for the instrument and work very well.
Yes, because what struck me particularly was how this worked in the cello sonata of Rachmaninoff. Now, two things came to mind in this. Rachmaninoff himself, as we've just been saying, of course, himself wrote most poignantly for the saxophone in the first movement of the symphonic dances. So already this was an instrument that was natural for him. But when you realize what he was doing with the cello, I think this is a tribute to your musicianship, but also it does back up entirely what you've said about the versatility and adaptability of the saxophone. It's an extraordinarily successful arrangement. It really seems to almost be like an extension of what the cello was doing. Now, I think on any other instrument that would be almost impossible, but it's worked remarkably well in terms of the colour, in terms of the character, and the style of what Rachmaninoff had originally composed in this piece.
Well, thank you so much. You know, that slow movement of the Rachmaninoff cello sonata, I think it's just absolutely gorgeous, and I'm very, very happy with the way that somehow works on the saxophone. I don't know why, but to me it works very, very effectively. Because I think part of it is that you can create a power on the saxophone, both sort of an emotional power and a power in terms of volume that really, really fits the way the piece builds, and that just I've been very, very happy with the way that works on the saxophone.
I'd like to go to the Demessima, the work which is the Fantaisie sur un thème original. Now, here's a composer I have to tell you is unknown to me. When I heard this, I was very struck with your wonderful grasp of the classical nature and the romantic nature of this piece, because, of course, it is from the time of the beginning and earlier part of the 19th century.
Yes, it's a very relatively unknown composer. He lived only about 33 years, and it was a very early stage of the saxophone, because the saxophone is a very new instrument compared to other orchestral instruments. It was invented just like around 1840. So this Demessima lived 1833 to 1866. So it's very, very early stage of the saxophone, but it shows off its virtuosic side in a very, very unique and impressive way, and its romantic side that I think is really, really terrific. So it's one of my favorite pieces to perform, without a doubt, and it's just, audiences love it. It's a real blast to play.
Listening to your performance of this on the Classical Connect website, I was struck by a few things I'd just like to discuss with you. For instance, at first I almost thought, well, this could perhaps almost be Weber. Incidentally, what I said before, it wasn't really correct, was it, when I said the earlier part of the 19th century? The piece was written, of course, in the middle of the 19th century, but it feels to me like early 19th century music in some respects, particularly for me this opening, which does remind me, could almost be from the 18th century, except, as I just said, for me, it does have this resonance of some of the turns and some of the more, shall we say, almost operatic sounds that vocal...
Oh, yeah. It reminds me of Rossini a lot, actually.
Yes.
To me, it is very operatic.
Absolutely. And yet, at the same time, as it progresses, we then get unmistakably French lines and unmistakably French lyrical colours and those phrases which are so French in their kind of delicacy and restraint. And then at the end, I thought to myself, well, I'll bet you when we get to the end something of fireworks is going to happen, but I wasn't prepared for quite such fireworks. Goodness me, I mean, that's a tremendous piece of tour de force virtuosity at the end. How you bring it off is stunning. And well, I suppose there must have been players around at the time that the composer hoped would do it.
Yes. I mean, yeah, the ending is terrific fun. And, I mean, today it's like the kind of piece that just is perfect to end a recital program with, because it's just, like you said, it's just fireworks. You know, it's just full of energy and full of character in that piece. You know, it goes from romantic to slightly classical sections. It's a very, very vocal piece, and it's terrific.